The Last Hunt by Daniel Vaughan. Forward. This is a story born from shadow and smoke. Long before maps, before fences, before history was carved in paper, the people of the Great Basin told stories of things that lived in caves, that walked like men but were not, and that took without mercy. These stories were not myths to them. They were memories. Among the Piute, Shoshone, Washoe, and other nations of the region, tales persist of a terrible enemy, red-haired giants, cannibals, taller than any warrior, with eyes like fire and hands that could crush bone. Stories say the tribes once came together to stop them. Some say they lit a fire so great the mountain still remembers. What follows is a fictional tale, but the bones of it are real. Chapter 1. Smoke on the Wind. The village of Red Willow sat nestled at the base of two limestone ridges, where the riverbed bent like a sleeping snake. In the wet season the water ran thick and cold through its spine, bringing fish and life to the brush and roots. In the dry moons it became a trail of cracked mud, carved deep with footprints of mule deer and coyotes. Its people rose with the sun and lay with the stars. Mornings began with songs to the river spirit, old verses carried in the breath of mothers and echoed by children stomping cold feet in the dust. Smoke from fire pits rose in delicate spirals while corn was ground, hides were stretched, and fish were laid to dry along woven racks. Children ran between tents made of elk hide and reed thatch, chasing one another with laughter and sticks. Warriors sharpened stone blades and mended arrow shafts in the shade. Elders carved stories into bone and wood, slow and careful, that their grandchildren might someday understand what the sky remembered. Among them was a boy named Sura, barely into his 15th winter. Quick-footed, sharp-eyed, and full of questions, he spent most days shadowing his older brother, Halleck, who had begun his training as a hunter. Their mother, Rima, wove bright shawls and spoke often of the old spirits. She believed the land listened, that the river kept secrets. Sura was known for climbing higher than the other children, for daring jumps between stone outcroppings, for slipping through the narrow deer trails with a laugh that made even the wary elders smile. He'd been bitten by a badger once, and carried the scar on his wrist like a badge. Every night before sleeping, he would ask his mother about the stars, where they went during the day, and whether their light ever touched the caves. Halleck, taller and broader, was quieter, more patient. He taught Sura how to read tracks in dry dust, how to move without snapping twigs, how to feel the difference between wind and stillness. When they sat around the fire, Halleck often carved little animals from bone and gifted them to the younger children. Red Willow was not large, but it was full of stories, of shared work, of small joys and quiet wisdom. The people lived by what they gathered and hunted, and shared what they had. No one went cold unless the night itself conspired to make it so. That evening, the fire circle was alive with movement. Drums beat a slow rhythm as the young men danced in a ring, their shadows flickering across painted tents. Sura sat beside Rima, chewing roasted pine nuts, eyes drawn to the sparks that floated like stars from the fire. Halleck returned late from a hunt, laying a pair of rabbits near the flame and tousling his brother's hair. "Tomorrow," Halleck said, grinning, "we go north. You'll learn to track elk." Sura smiled, and Rima gave a small nod of approval. The family sat close, warm and full, beneath the breath of the stars. No one knew it would be the last time. It began by the river. A woman named Eli had risen early, long before the drums of dawn. Her dog, a lean brown mongrel named Tekka, padded beside her as she made her way to the water's edge with a carved wooden bowl in hand. The stars still lingered in the sky, and the moon cast long shadows across the river stones. She knelt and dipped the bowl into the cold stream, watching the ripples break the stillness. Tekka growled, low, rumbling, almost questioning, his ears pinned back. Eli froze. Across the river, in the dense wall of brush and trees, something shifted. Not loudly, not suddenly, just enough. Then she saw them. Eyes. Two of them, set too high, too wide apart, glinting with a pale yellow light. Not like the eyes of a wolf or bear, not reflecting light, holding it. Watching. Tekka barked once, a warning. Then he leapt. He bounded across the rocks and into the river, teeth bared, growling, vanishing into the brush on the far side. There was a snap. A yelp. Then silence. Eli stood, her breath locked in her chest. Tekka's body came flying back across the river like a thrown rag. It struck the stones just behind her with a sickening crack, limbs bent at impossible angles. She turned to run. The forest exploded. Shapes surged through the trees, huge, heavy, silent. The earth trembled beneath their charge. Eli ran faster than she ever had, the camp lights flickering in the distance through the trees. She was almost there. She saw the fire circle. Tents, movement, her people. Then she felt it. Hands. Enormous cold fingers like branches wrapping around her chest and lifting her from the ground. Her ribs cracked. Her legs kicked helplessly in the air. The last thing Eli saw before her vision dimmed was her village, waking to her final scream. A shout rose from the village, a startled cry, quickly echoed by others. The drums stopped. Figures moved toward the firelight with weapons drawn and confusion in their eyes. "What was that?" someone asked. "Where's Eli?" asked another. Sura had just stood from his place by the fire when the body hit the ground. Eli, the woman who was drawing water from the river, landed in the center of the fire circle with a terrible thud, limbs twisted and broken with a look of sheer horror etched on her face. A gasp rippled through the villagers. Then came the scream. It tore the sky in two, high-pitched and ragged, too loud for any throat born of man. It echoed off the cliffs and struck the hearts of the sleeping like a stone-shattering ice. Dogs barked and scattered. The fire in the center of camp flared suddenly as if startled, casting frantic shadows. And then the shapes came. They emerged from the tree line, broad, lurching figures that moved with a terrible silence. The moon caught on something wet streaked across their chests. Their hair hung in ropes of rusted red, and their breathing hissed and steamed in the cold. Halek was the first to meet them. He came from the hunter's tent, a spear in hand and confusion in his eyes. He shouted something, but it was cut short by a blur of motion. A giant arm swept through the air and caught him mid-torso. There was a crack, a spray of something dark, and Kalak crumpled without a sound. Sura screamed. Rima, Sura's mother, grabbed him, dragging him toward the fish racks. He stumbled and nearly fell, but she held him fast. "Under!" she gasped. "Now!" She shoved him beneath the racks, behind the hides and hanging fish. Her hands gripped his cheeks for one fleeting moment. "Do not cry out, do not move, not until I come back." She kissed his forehead, then turned, and ran. Sura pressed his hands over his mouth. The camp was screams and death. People were ripped from tents, some screamed, some didn't have time. Warriors met the giants with spears and knives, but most blades shattered against the size of them. One man drove a hatchet into a leg the size of a tree trunk and was crushed beneath a descending fist like clay under a mallet. The giants didn't roar. They didn't speak. They breathed hard and steady, like wind through flame. One of them stooped, entering the main lodge. It pushed aside the doorway like it was grass. The thatch caught fire in its wake as it knocked over a lit torch. When it re-emerged, it was dragging a dead woman's body by the hair on her head. A leg trailed behind. Sura saw the anklet his mother had woven from river shells. He wanted to scream, but covered his mouth after a sharp inhale of breath. The giant turned its head slowly. Its eyes glowed pale yellow, not from within, but as if reflecting fire from somewhere too deep. It stared, not at Sura, but through everything, through the tents, through the trees, through the earth. Sura couldn't feel his hands. The creatures moved on as quickly as they appeared, vanishing into the night. Hours passed like years. Sura lay shaking, breathing through the coppery stink of blood and burnt hide, until even the wind seemed afraid to move. Only ash remained. 2 days later, Sura stumbled into the Washoe camp near the salt dunes, covered in ash and dried blood. His bare feet were raw and blistered, his skin streaked with soot, and his eyes vacant, like he had left something behind in the smoke that still clung to his hair. He collapsed just beyond the camp's outer fire circle. A young girl saw him first, screamed, and brought the elders running. He didn't react to the noise. He just blinked, over and over, like each time might wake him from the memory. He was brought before the healers. They poured water over his lips. He drank, vomited, and curled into a shivering ball. A woman laid a hide blanket over him and hummed an old song from the old days. He didn't seem to hear it. That night he began to whisper. Disjointed words, half names. He cried out for Calic, for his mother, for the stars to come back. When he finally spoke clearly, it was around a fire. The elders sat close. A warrior pressed warm broth into Sura's hands, which trembled as he drank. They were tall, he said hoarsely, taller than the lodges. Their hair was red, red like sunburnt cliffs. Their skin was dry, cracked. Their eyes, they didn't blink. They didn't look. They just took. He paused, shuddering. They killed so many. And their hands... gods. Their hands were so big. One of the elders asked gently, Did anyone else escape? Sura shook his head slowly. They took everyone. His voice broke then, and he wept for a long time. When sleep finally claimed him, he did not dream. He simply sank into silence, while the circle of elders sat awake, staring into a fire that now felt far too small. By dusk, messengers were sent to the 3 great tribes, Piute, Shoshone, and Washoe. The old fire circle in the valley basin, long left to silence, was lit once more. Its stones, blackened by age and ash. Tanu arrived with his bow slung over one shoulder and his thoughts heavy. A tracker and scout for the Piute, Tanu was known among the tribes for his sharp eyes, quiet step, and memory of every trail between the ridges. He had grown up in the shadows of red willow and knew the forest paths like the lines on his own hands. He was not a warrior by trade, but he had hunted alone since he was 12, and his arrows never missed when it mattered. Red willow was close to his heart. His cousin's daughter had lived there. He had hunted those forests. He had never feared them, until now. Nava, grim and silent, stood near the fire. A warrior of many winters, his eyes bore the weight of hard truths. Beside him stood the elder Ahu, the oldest among all the tribes. His back was stooped, his eyes clouded with age, but still sharp beneath the weight of memory. He was a firekeeper, a speaker of songs older than most could understand. He had outlived 3 chiefs, and had been present the last time a fire circle was lit in fear, not celebration. His hands trembled as he laid carved bones into the base of the pyre, whispering prayers to the smoke, words meant to carry truth to the sky and warnings to the earth. As the tribes gathered around the fire, Ahu stood to speak. "A tale has come through blood and smoke," he said. "A boy speaks of giants, of red hair, of silence where once there were children." A younger warrior scoffed. "The boy is broken. He saw raiders, not demons." "Raiders don't tear apart elk hide with their hands," Nava said, stepping forward. "Raiders don't leave prints longer than a man's arm." A woman from the Washoe added, "My grandmother told stories of the red-haired ones, that they lived in caves, that they ate people. I never believed them, until now." Another elder leaned forward. "There is a name, an old name." "No," someone whispered. "We do not say it." Ahu's voice followed, firm despite his years. "That is why they return, because we fear their name, because we treat legend like a sleeping snake instead of a warning. We must not be afraid to name what hunts us. Only when named can the fire be kindled again." "Sitaka," he said. The name cut the air like a blade. The fire cracked violently. A gust of wind rose through the trees, cold, sour, and wrong. "They were once real," Ahu continued, "long ago, before even our great-grandfather's bones were laid in the hills. The Siteka came from the north, in reed boats, towering, pale-skinned, red-haired. They killed, they stole, they ate." He looked around the circle. "Our people united once to drive them into the mountain caves. We lit the fire and sealed them inside. We made them myth, but myths remember, and sometimes they return." Murmurs broke into fear. Some demanded war. Others urged caution. Nava's voice rang clear. "We do not yet know the truth. We need eyes, fast feet, a shadow hunter." He turned to Tanu. "You know the land. You know Red Willow. You are Piute. Go. See what remains. Bring back truth." Tanu met his gaze. He thought of her, his cousin's daughter who had not yet been named. Just a slip of a girl with wild hair and painted cheeks, always laughing too loudly and running barefoot along the shallows. He remembered her bright green tunic, the one she refused to take off even after it tore. He had taught her how to notch an arrow, how to climb the cottonwoods, how to walk without being seen. She had once told him she was going to be a scout like him, and he had smiled. Now the memory cut like obsidian. He nodded. "I'll go." Ahu stepped forward and pressed a bundle into his hand. Sage, cedar bark, and a painted charm made from the smoothed bone of a mountain fox. The charm was marked with red ochre lines and tied with braided sinew. It smelled of old smoke and river clay. Ahu's hand lingered for a moment over Tanu's, his eyes full of something between sorrow and certainty. "This was mine," he said. "It was given to me long ago, when I was asked to walk into a place where no man should. It kept me whole then. Perhaps it will do the same for you." He nodded towards the bundle. "Burn the sage when you enter the remains of Red Willow. Let the smoke guide what is hidden into the light. Carry the cedar at your chest. It carries the strength of old roots, and they will know it. And the charm must never leave your neck. If they see it, they may remember me, and they may hesitate. That is all the time you will have. Get out before it burns out." "If they are there," Ahu said, "they will smell you. But fire and truth may yet guard your steps." Tanu left before the fire died. Alone, he stepped into the dark, toward a place where the wind no longer spoke. Chapter 2. The Circle Gathers. The earth was cold beneath Tanu's feet as he walked the narrow ridge path above the valley. Morning light filtered through high gray clouds, casting a dull sheen over the rocks and brush. The silence of the land was strange, not peaceful, but expectant, as though the forest held its breath. Each step away from the fire circle made the charm at his neck feel heavier. It swung beneath his tunic, the smoothed bone warm against his chest despite the chill. He had worn talismans before, bear tooth, obsidian shards, even a hawk feather given by a dying friend, but none had carried this kind of weight, not just in mass, but in memory. Ahu's hands had trembled when he passed it over. That meant something. Everything the old man did meant something. The trail itself had not changed, still marked by sun-bleached stones and dry scrub, still winding along the slope above the ravine. But it felt unfamiliar now, alien, as if the trees watched him pass with eyes he could not see. Tanu's hand stayed close to the bough slung across his back. He passed an old hunting blind built from twisted limbs and brush, mostly collapsed now. He remembered building it with Kalek and 2 others from the village years ago. They had spent the whole day hiding from elk that never came, eating dry seeds and daring each other to jump off the lower ledge into the icy stream. His cousin's daughter had followed them without permission, barefoot, leaves tangled in her hair. She had brought a handful of stolen berries and told ghost stories with a voice far too bold for her size. When the sun went down and they made their way back, she had asked him how someone could be afraid of the dark if the stars lived in it. He had laughed and lifted her onto his back. Now he walked that same trail alone. He crested a ridge and paused. Before him stretched the hunting basin that fed Red Willow's people, a wide stretch of golden grassland ringed by brittle pines and dry gullies. No smoke rose from the village, no birds called, the wind was still. But something was different. Tanu knelt beside a cedar shrub and scanned the slope below. The grass had been flattened in wide arcs, like something massive had moved through it. He spotted deep depressions in the soil, too broad to be bear, too long to be elk. One of them ended in a shallow scrape in the stone, gouged as though by claws. The land was bruised, scarred, not by nature, but by something it hadn't known in a very long time. He moved cautiously until he reached the overlook, a place where the river curved and the ground leveled into an old ceremonial clearing. There, on a flat blackened boulder once used for smoke offerings, he unwrapped Ahu's bundle. Sage twisted with river grass, a strip of cedar bark, and a small wedge of chipped flint. With practiced hands, he struck fire. The sage lit slowly, curling into smoldering gray ribbons. Tanu leaned low, feeding it breath, watching the smoke rise into the motionless air. He pressed it into a carved divot in the stone and whispered the old words Ahu had taught him. Smoke for the hidden, fire for the feared, step light, speak less, let truth rise before the sun. The wind didn't carry the smoke. It rose, thin and reluctant, as if the sky did not want it. He tied the cedar bark under his shirt, just above his heart. Its scent was strong, sweet, bitter, grounding. He touched the foxbone charm hanging from his neck, pressing it flat against his skin. For a moment, the world held still. Then something shifted. Not a sound, not a shape, just a feeling. Faint, like a shadow passing behind his thoughts. Tanu straightened, suddenly aware of how still the air had become. The smoke from the sage rose in a tight column, perfectly vertical, like a warning finger. Then, without warning, the breeze shifted, not from the mountains behind him, where the wind usually flowed, but from below, from the basin, from red willow. It wasn't strong, just enough to brush the side of his face, but it carried something foul. A sour, dry scent like old blood and scorched bark. Not rot, but something older, like the breath of a long-sealed cave. Tanu's eyes swept the ridgeline and the trees below, every sense sharpened. The forest remained still. Too still. No chirps, no rustle, not even the creak of branch on branch. The smoke, once rising straight, now curled uncertainly. It twisted toward the direction of the breeze, as if it wanted to flee. A chill prickled up Tanu's neck. He didn't see anything, but his body remembered what his eyes could not. Some part of him, deep and buried in bone, knew he wasn't alone. His heartbeat quickened. Something was watching. He didn't see it, didn't hear it, but the land had changed. The silence was no longer expectant. It was hiding. When the sage burned to ash, he smothered the embers with earth and stood. The smell of cedar clung to his hands, and the charm felt heavier against his chest. Tanu drew his bow and nocked an arrow, not to shoot, but to be ready. He stepped off the overlook and began the descent toward Red Willow, where silence waited like a predator beneath the ashes. The land changed as Tanu crossed into the basin. It was subtle at first, a shift in color, a stillness in the air, but soon the signs became unmistakable. The grass underfoot was crushed in broad, irregular swaths, like something massive had swept across the ground. Tall stalks of brush lay flat, not burned, not broken, just pressed, trampled by weight no deer or man could produce. Tanu crouched by a print near the base of a slope. The soil had hardened, but the depth remained. He placed his hand inside it. The heel of the print was wide, the toes spaced unnaturally far apart. Each was the size of his fingers. He rose slowly and followed the trail. The path to Red Willow had once been marked by smooth river stones and hanging wind chimes of bone and shell, placed to warn away spirits and mark the border between hunting ground and hearth. Now the stones were scattered, cracked and overturned. The chimes were gone, strings snapped or missing entirely. One bone flute lay broken in the dirt, as though crushed underfoot. As he neared the rise above the village, the air changed again. Not in scent, but in weight. It pressed down on him, thick, dry, unmoving, like walking into the memory of a fire. Tanu crouched low, moved silently through the brush, and peered over the ledge. Red Willow was no more. What had once been a circle of woven tents and smoking cook fires, fish racks and drying hides, was now a field of ash and torn earth. Tents were flattened or burned to blackened husks. The central fire pit was overturned, its stones scattered like a kicked-out tooth. No bodies, no blood, just the absence of everything. Tanu stepped down carefully, heart pounding. He moved through the remains with the reverence of one walking through graves. He saw Rima's loom, splintered, its weaving unfinished. A child's bone carving of a badger, half buried in soot. Calic's spear haft, snapped clean near the grip, still stained dark. But there were no bodies, no animals, no birds overhead, not even flies. Only the wind, beginning to move again, slow and circling. At the far end of the camp he found a set of marks unlike the rest. A trail had been carved into the ground, wide, shallow, dragging, as if something had pulled weight across the earth without lifting it. The line ran from the edge of the village toward a break in the cliffs. An old goat path, a place where, long ago, children had dared each other to climb. Tanu followed it halfway, then stopped. A single bloody handprint pressed onto the stone. Huge. Too wide for a man. The fingers were long and jointed thickly. Tanu put his hand on top of it, and even with fingers outstretched, did not fill the palm of the handprint. He backed away, slowly, until the handprint was out of sight. Then he found a small shell anklet, crushed near a collapsed tent pole. Green thread. River shells. He knelt beside it and swallowed hard. No remains. But this had been Remus. He bowed his head, gripped the earth, and whispered something between a prayer and a promise. Then he rose, scanning the cliffs above. There was a cave opening there. Small, easy to miss, but the drag marks led straight to it. Something had returned to the dark. He wouldn't follow. Not yet. He marked the path with a piece of white quartz from his pouch, turned, and disappeared back into the brush. Tanu didn't leave. He should have. Every instinct screamed for him to turn back, to carry what he had seen to the fire circle and let others decide what came next. But something deeper, a tracker's stubbornness, or perhaps the seed of vengeance, held him there. He found a perch above the ruined camp, tucked behind a stone outcropping that overlooked the goat path and the cave mouth. From here, he could see the drag marks in the soil where the earth had been torn and pulled toward the cliffs. He could see the broken remnants of red willow and the circle of trees that stood like mourners around it. He waited until the sun bled out behind the ridges. Shadows stretched long. The air grew colder. The wind returned in strange, circling gusts that carried the dry stink of ash and old earth. Then, movement. A sound, low and heavy, like breath pushed through stone. Tanu crouched lower, his breath stilled, muscles tense. Something stepped into the mouth of the cave. It was massive. Not lumbering, but deliberate. It ducked slightly as it exited, brushing the stone with a shoulder that scraped softly against rock. Tanu stared. For a moment, the thing stood at the entrance, half lit by moonlight. Its skin was pale, not white, not gray, but the color of sunless stone. Its body, wrapped in crude hides and what looked like strips of cloth or hair, stretched wider than any man Tanu had ever seen. Its arms hung low, its hands enormous and empty. Then the head turned, and it saw him, not in passing, not a glance. It stared directly into the shadow where Tanu knelt, motionless behind brush and stone. The giant's eyes were set too far apart, too deep, and they glinted with a yellow tinge that didn't reflect like animal eyes in the dark. They drank the light. They locked onto him and did not look away. Tanu's body refused to move. His hand drifted to the charm at his chest, gripping it as though it might catch whatever was pouring from those eyes and flinging it into his soul. The incense Ahu had given him faded hours ago. The stare held. 10 heartbeats, then 20, then more. It didn't blink. It didn't bare teeth or reach for a weapon. It just looked, slightly sniffing the air, as if memorizing him, as if remembering something that hadn't happened yet. Then, slowly, the giant turned away. It stepped backward into the cave's black mouth, swallowed by shadow without sound. Tanu remained frozen for a long time. Only when the moon had risen clear and high did he move. One step back, then another, then a silent retreat down the slope and into the trees. He would run through the night. The others had to know. Tanu moved like a shadow between trees, silent and fast, his footsteps barely brushing the earth. But his mind dragged behind. Each time he blinked, he saw the cave, the shape in its mouth, the unnatural stillness of the village, the scorched shell anklet crushed in the dirt. He had hunted in silence before. He had tracked elk through freezing wind, followed blood trails of wounded wolves. But this was different. There was no path to follow, no animal to reason with. What he had seen was not prey. It wasn't even predator. It was something wrong. The charm Ahu had given him bounced lightly against his chest with each stride, the cord slick with sweat. The forest was darker on the return. Not with nightfall, though night was coming, but with something weightier, as if the trees had learned fear in his absence. Every rustle made him reach for his bow. Every distant crack of branch sounded like the beginning of an attack. He crossed back into familiar land before sunrise. The old council path rose before him, lit by the low embers of a still-burning fire. His legs ached. His breath came ragged. But he didn't stop. Not until he stood once again beneath the carved bones of the fire circle's arch and said, to no one and everyone, "They're real!" Heads turned. Shadows shifted. Someone moved to help him sit, but he remained standing. I saw the camp. I saw where they dragged the bodies. I saw one, only for a moment, tall, silent, pale. It looked at nothing and yet seemed to see everything. He swallowed. The old stories were true, and they've come back. Tanu told them everything. He spoke of the flattened camp, the silence where no birds called, the drag marks in the dirt. He described the ruined tents, the missing bodies, the shell anklet crushed into the soil. He told them of the shape he saw in the cave mouth. Taller than any man, unmoving but aware. He told them how it sniffed the air like a beast, then stepped back into darkness like it had never left. Some listened in silence. Others shook their heads in denial. One warrior spat into the fire and muttered that shadows grow taller in frightened minds. Another crossed his arms and said the boy had simply seen ghosts. But no one laughed, not even the skeptics, because the wind had changed. Everyone could feel it. When Tanu finished, no one spoke for a long time. The fire cracked softly in the silence. Then the elders stood and walked away, one by one, leaving Tanu alone with his thoughts, and with the weight of what he'd brought back from Red Willow. The fire had burned low when Ahu came to him. Tanu sat in silence, staring into the coals. The others had gone to sleep or wandered to the edges of the camp to speak in hushed tones. But Tanu remained. His mind refused to rest. Ahu walked without sound, though age bowed his shoulders. He sat beside Tanu slowly, lowering himself to the earth with the patience of someone who no longer feared the weight of years. For a long moment, they didn't speak. Then Ahu reached into the folds of his outer robe and untied a section near his chest. He peeled back the old leather, revealing the inner lining of his tunic. Dark red fibers, faded by time, but unmistakable in texture. Tanu frowned. Woven cloth. Ahu shook his head. Not cloth. He tugged one of the threads free and handed it to Tanu. It was coarse, thicker than any plant fiber, crimped and wiry like an animal's, but it held the unnatural dull red hue of dried blood and rusted iron. Tanu's eyes widened. Hair, Ahu said quietly. From one of them. Tanu looked up. You fought them? Ahu nodded, his eyes clouded with the weight of memory. I was young. Younger than you are now. I was a torch-bearer. I carried fire into the caves while the warriors forced the giants back with spears and screams. One of them broke through the line. It crushed 3 men before I got close enough to blind it. It burned like pine bark." He paused, then added, "But it didn't scream. Even on fire, it looked right at me while it burned, like it was remembering me." Tanu turned the strand over in his fingers. It felt heavy, like it didn't want to be held. "I kept a lock of it," Ahu said. "Wove it into my tunic, not as a trophy, as a reminder." He pulled the cloth closed again, tying the knot slowly. "When you see them, you'll understand. You'll feel how old they are, how wrong. They are not part of the world, not anymore. Maybe never were." Tanu swallowed. "What stopped them last time?" "Unity," Ahu said, "and fire, and enough death to water the roots of every tree in this valley." He looked at Tanu now, truly looked at him. "You were right to be afraid. The brave ones died first." Tanu stared into the dying fire, fingers still curled around the strand of red hair. He didn't sleep that night. Chapter 3: The Gathering Fire. Tanu found Nava sharpening a stone blade beneath a torch pole at the edge of the camp. The old warrior sat cross-legged on a flat slab of granite, lit from one side by flickering flame, and from the other by the cold gleam of the moon. He didn't look up when Tanu approached. "You saw it with your own eyes?" Nava asked, voice quiet but certain. Tanu nodded. "I saw enough." Nava paused in his work, testing the edge with a thumb. "Describe it again." Tanu swallowed. "Tall. Pale. Its face, I don't know. It was human but wrong. Like a mask carved from memory. I didn't get close. I didn't need to." "And the camp?" "Gone. Crushed. No bodies. Just drag marks. Like something had gathered the dead and taken them away." Nava grunted. "That's how it was the first time," he said. Tanu looked at him. "You believe Ahu's stories about them?" "I believed in them before he told us anything," Nava said, "because my grandfather told me the same tales when I was still skinning rabbits with a flint shard." He sheathed the blade and looked up, meeting Tanu's eyes. "There's a difference between stories and warnings. One entertains. The other keeps you alive. That's why the old one spoke so carefully. It wasn't fear. It was respect." Tanu sat beside him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nava said, "They'll argue." "They always do. Half the council will say it's superstition, that we're chasing shadows, that war will tear us apart." "And the other half?" "They'll remember what happened the last time we hesitated." He stood, stretching with a quiet groan, lifting his arms. Tanu could briefly see the scars left as evidence of many battles on his stomach and sides. "We don't have time for old wounds. We'll gather at first light. You'll speak. Tell them what you saw. I'll stand behind you." Tanu stood too. "You think they'll listen?" "I think they'll feel it, in their bones, just like we do now." Nava gave a nod and turned away, leaving Tanu alone with the thoughts of what was to come. By first light, the fire circle was alive again. 3 tribes sat shoulder to shoulder, Piute, Shoshone, and Washoe, facing the central pyre as the coals from the night before hissed under fresh kindling. Elders sat close to the flame. Warriors stood behind them with arms folded. No one carried food. No one sang. This was not a council for ceremony. It was a council for war. Some of the elders had already heard what Tanu said the night before, when he returned shaken and grim from the ruins of Red Willow. But not all had been present. And even those who had listened then now sat with straighter backs and stiffer jaws, ready to hear it again with the full weight of the tribe behind them. Nava stood first. Our scout has returned, he said, motioning to Tanu. He saw what he was sent to find, and it is worse than we feared. Tanu stepped forward. His voice didn't rise. He didn't need it to. The silence leaned in to listen. I saw the village, or at least what's left of it. The tents were flattened. The chimes were gone. There were no bodies. Only the shape of what had come through, and a cave above the basin. Something waits inside it. He paused, remembering the eyes, the shape in the dark. One of them stood at the entrance, he said. It didn't chase me. It didn't even move quickly. It knew I would leave. It let me go, like it wasn't worried. A ripple of unease passed through the circle. They're real, Tanu finished. And they remember us. An elder from the Washoe, Yanu, hair bound in iron rings, rose to speak. I lost 3 grandchildren in that village. I would see fire brought to the caves again. But I also remember the last time we tried. We lost a generation. What if we fail again? From the Shoshone, a man named Beacon stood, tall and broad-shouldered. This may not be the same threat. A cave bear could scatter bones. A sickness could hollow a village. Nava interrupted. I've killed a cave bear. It doesn't walk on 2 legs and leave no blood. Voices rose, accusations, doubt, rage, fear. Then Ahu stood. The crowd quieted. Ahu stepped into the center of the circle and untied the old knot at his chest. Slowly, deliberately. He opened the fold of his tunic to reveal the lining, red fibers, coarse and matted, woven through the fabric like veins. This, he said, voice low and steady, is not thread. He pulled a strand free and held it up. The firelight revealed its strange sheen, copper red, thick and wiry, like hair taken from a creature, not a man. Hair, Ahu said, from one of them, taken with fire and fear. The murmuring began, but he raised his hand, and it stilled. I was there the last time. I was younger than this one. He gestured to a boy, no older than 12 years. And I thought myself brave because I carried the fire. He paused. There were 6 of them. 6. That was all it took to wipe out 3 entire camps. A gasp broke the circle that quickly silenced. They came before sunrise. They moved in silence. No war cry. No warning. Just destruction. They pulled tents apart like spider webs. They crushed bones with bare hands. One of them tore a man in 2 with such force his blood painted the trees. Ahu looked down at the fire. They were not men, not really. They walked upright, yes. They had eyes, hands, and mouths, but their proportions were wrong. Their arms were too long, legs that bowed like elk, shoulders so wide they had to turn sideways to pass through even the largest tent. Their skin was pale, not the pale of a man who has seen winter, but the pale of something born underground. He took a breath. And their mouths. Ahu raised his head and looked directly into the crowd. They had 2 rows of teeth, one behind the other, like the great beasts that swim in the sea, made for tearing, for eating. When they killed, they did not leave the dead behind. They carried them, as if every battle was a harvest. Someone cursed softly. They could not be fought like men. Arrows slowed them, but did not stop them. Spears broke on their ribs. I saw one impaled through the belly. He kept walking, ripped the spear out, and threw the man who held it against a rock so hard it broke the stone. He let that settle before continuing. We drove them to the caves only because for one reason or another they didn't try to stop us. I am not sure if they considered us a threat. We lit fires all around them, starved them, and tried to make them run out of places to run. When they finally fled into the back of the cave, we filled the entrance with pine pitch and smoke bundles and set it alight. Ahu touched the red strands on his tunic and let out a breath like smoke leaving his bones. When the fire was lit and the cave roared with flame, one of them tried to come back out. Our best warrior managed to gouge its eyes before he was torn in half. The giant was blinded, but hit the ground and held its torn face without making a sound. But still it fought. Still it crawled through the burning stones like something born of flame and hate. Ahu stared into the fire, as if seeing it again. A warrior beside me threw his spear. It glanced off its collarbone. Another loosed an arrow, but it only made the thing mad. Then I stepped forward. I had no weapon left, just a torch, half burned, dripping with pitch. I drove it into its face. A pause. It clawed at me, struck me across the chest. I fell. But the fire took to its fur skin wraps like dry grass. It didn't run or scream. It knelt to one knee and lifted its torn face toward me. Even as it was burning alive, it focused its eyeless gaze directly upon me until it crumpled into a lifeless heap. He lifted the hem of his tunic again and held the lock of red hair tight between both hands. When the fire had fully taken its life spark, I went to it. I cut this from its charred head, not as a trophy, but as a warning. I wove it into my clothes so I would never forget what I saw that day, so I could never pretend it was just a dream. His voice softened. So when you doubt, when you scoff at old songs, look at this. This is no fable. This is the hair, something that was never meant to walk among us. He turned, facing all sides of the circle. If we do not act, they will come again. They will grow bolder. They will stop taking one village and begin taking all of them. Nava stepped forward again. Then we act. He looked to the crowd. I will lead the war party. We need warriors, runners, slingers, firebearers, hunters who know the caves. This is not a raid. This is not a chase. This is the last hunt. A long pause followed. Then, one by one, hands rose. Weya, the Washoe trapper, stepped forward and said, I'll bring the fire. A Piute with a scarred face and broken nose nodded. My blade still holds. A Shoshone woman, barely more than a girl, lifted a torch. Let them remember us too. The circle was no longer a place of fear. It had become resistance, a hope for the future. The fire circle broke apart slowly, like stone splintering under frost. No one cheered. No one sang. This was not a celebration. It was a reckoning. The warriors who stepped forward knew what they were choosing. Not glory, but necessity. A return to an old war that should have stayed buried. Nava gave no grand speeches. He simply began assigning roles, moving among the volunteers like a man shaping a hunting party, not an army. He picked with care, runners for speed, slingers for distance, hunters who knew the cliffs. 2 elders from each tribe would remain behind to coordinate defenses in case the worst happened. Tanu stood near the fire, watching. Weya approached him first. She carried a coil of sinew rope and a bundle of wrapped thorns strapped to her back. Her jaw was set like stone. You still shake? She asked. Tanu hesitated. A little. Good, she said. Only fools walk into darkness without fear. She handed him a satchel. Fire bundles, sage and pine pitch, dry as bone. You'll carry them. He took it with a nod. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen what they look like up close. At the far end of the clearing, Ahu prepared the ceremonial flame. He stood beside an ironwood bowl set on 3 stones, feeding cedar shavings into its center. Over this, he laid dried sage, mountain pine, and old foxbrush. From a pouch at his side, He drew a small bundle of embers wrapped in bark and blown into flame from his breath alone. The fire caught instantly. This would be the soul fire, the first carried into the caves, the one meant to light the others. A spark from the past made into a weapon for the present. One by one, warriors came forward to anoint their weapons and hands with the smoke. It curled around their fingers, binding them in the memory of the first fire. Tanu stepped forward and did the same. As the smoke rose, he thought again of the shape in the cave, of its eyes, and of the way it had looked at him, not like prey, but like someone it knew. As he turned from the flame, Nava met his gaze. "We leave at first light," the war chief said. "If they've truly returned, we finish what our ancestors began." Tanu nodded, his fingers brushing the foxbone charm at his chest. "If we can." Chapter 4. Into the dark. They left at dawn. No drums sounded, no prayers were sung aloud. The people gathered in silence to watch them go, fathers holding children, elders clutching cedar bundles, mothers whispering names to the wind. Smoke from the morning cook fires drifted through the trees like a fading memory, and not a single crow cried out to mark their passing. The war party moved in 2 lines, feet quiet on the trail. Tanu walked near the front, beside Nava and Weya. Behind them came 12 others, each chosen for a different strength. A tracker who could follow footprints over dry stone, a runner who could outpace horses, a slinger whose stones flew straighter than arrows, a silent old woman named Sali, who carried fire and loss in equal measure. No one joked. No one asked when they'd return. Each warrior bore a painted charm blessed by the fire circle. Around their necks hung bones, feathers, river shells, bits of hide, tokens of ancestors and protection. Most also carried pitch-wrapped torches, tucked unlit into their belts, and leather satchels of dry pine needles and crushed sage. Tanu's eyes scanned the trail constantly. Though he walked in silence, his mind drifted to Kalek, who had taught him how to read the wind by watching leaves. To Sura, still curled in a blanket near the salt dunes, muttering his brother's name in his sleep. To Rima's final act, pushing her son under the fish racks, running into the flames without hesitation. He hadn't told the others everything, not the way the air had changed, not the way the giant had stared through him instead of at him. He wasn't sure they'd understand. By mid-morning, the trail narrowed into a dry riverbed. The sun barely touched the floor of it. Walls of sandstone rose on both sides like hollowed ribs. It was Nava who finally broke the silence. "The birds are gone," he said. No one responded. Not because they hadn't noticed, but because talking about it made it worse. The forest was too quiet. No bird song, no squirrel chatter, not even the buzzing of flies. It was the kind of silence that came only after something large had moved through, something that didn't belong. "The land is holding its breath," Nava muttered again, almost to himself. By midday, they came upon signs. In a clearing where travelers once rested, they found bones, shattered, gnawed, blackened by old fire. A child's bracelet still clung to a broken wrist. A stone axe lay beside a tree trunk, cracked in half. The tree itself had been marked by deep gouges, as if massive hands had tried to climb or pull it down. Weya crouched and touched one of the gouges. "They're close," she said, voice hollow. They moved slower after that. The trees thinned by late afternoon, revealing the broken cliffs beyond. They reached the high ridges by twilight. From a rocky overlook, the basin stretched wide below, silent, golden, and grave. Far off in the gathering shadows, The mouth of Lovelock Cave yawned like a wound in the earth. No smoke, no sign of movement. But still it watched, as if it was a living creature, waiting to consume any who strayed too close. They made camp on a slope ringed with boulders. They dug shallow fire pits, but did not light them. Food was cold, dried meat and old nuts. Conversation was sparse. Tanu sat alone at the edge of camp, staring down at the shape of the cave. He couldn't shake the feeling that something knew they were there. Not just watching, but waiting. Like it had never truly left. Like it had never truly been sealed at all. He ran a thumb over the charm Ahu had given him. The foxbone felt warm, as if the firekeeper's old magic still clung to it. Behind him, Weya whispered prayers to her ancestors. And above them, the stars blinked one by one into a sky that felt heavier than before. That night, no one truly slept. The warriors lay scattered in the brush, backs against stone, eyes half-lidded but never fully closed. The darkness felt thick, like a skin you had to wear. The cave in the distance loomed larger now, no longer a shape on the horizon, but a presence. An opening into something older than stories. Midway through the night, Kahi, one of the Shoshone scouts, rose quietly. He said nothing as he stepped away from his bedding, slipping between the rocks with his fire bundle still hanging from his belt. Weya noticed him leave, but didn't raise alarm. Relieving himself, she muttered to Nava, "Let him be." Minutes passed, then half an hour, then an hour. Nava stood. He walked to where Kahi had vanished and crouched, brushing his fingers across the dust. "No return trail," he said. They fanned out slowly, whispering his name. The air was cold, still. Nothing moved, not even the crickets. No signs of a struggle, no broken branches, no blood. "It's like he just vanished," Weya said. "He was a trained scout," Tanu added. "He wouldn't get lost walking 50 paces. Someone muttered, "Maybe he ran." Fear breaks strong men. "No," Weya snapped. "He left his bow behind. He loved that bow more than he loved his name." They stayed awake until dawn, watching the ridge with eyes that burned from lack of sleep and strain. The light came slowly, dragging long shadows across the rock. It was Weya who found what was left of him. Half a mile downslope, in a narrow clearing ringed by boulders, lay pieces. A shattered femur, the torn scrap of his sash, his charm split in half. A mound of gnawed bones laid in a neat circle, as if placed deliberately, not scattered in a predator's frenzy, but arranged with intent. And there were the teeth marks. Too wide, too deep, too clean. "They cracked the bones," Nava whispered, "to get at the marrow." Weya stared, her face unreadable. "He was taken," she said, "from within shouting distance of camp." "Impossible," muttered a younger warrior. "They'd have to be enormous to lift him like that. And quiet, that big, that close, no sound." Tanu crouched over the bones. His fingers ran along the grooves in the bone. Too smooth, too sharp. "They're not like animals," he said. "They don't move like us. They don't think like us." He turned his gaze back toward the cave mouth in the distance. "They move when they want. And when they want to, they are wind in tall grass." A heavy silence fell, the kind that presses against your ribs. "They were here," Nava said finally. "We didn't hear them. We didn't smell them. They came and went as they pleased." He picked up Kahi's broken charm and tied it to his belt. "No one walks alone," he said. "Not even to die." Weya walked past him. crouched beside a blood-stained patch of stone, and buried what was left of Kahi's braid in a shallow divot. Then she stood, and her voice, when it came, was colder than dawn. "They are watching us." They returned to the ridgeline in silence, heavy with the absence of Kahi. No one spoke, not out of respect, but because the quiet had become sacred. Even the wind held its breath. As they settled into a circle of stones, Tanu stood and began to unfasten the cedar bundle from his pack. "We need a fire," he said. "Not for warmth, not for light." Weya looked at him. "Then for what?" "For truth," Tanu replied, "and for memory. Ahu taught me before I went to Red Willow. He said if the land carries pain, you must burn a path back through it. The smoke reminds the earth of who walks it, and reminds what else walks it that we are not afraid." They listened as he knelt, and began preparing the pit. "You use cedar for strength," he explained, laying bark in the shape of a crosswind. "Sage to draw hidden things out. Pine for memory, so the ancestors do not forget your name." He crushed the pine needles with flat stone, the same way Ahu had shown him, and sprinkled them into the center. One by one, the others added to it. Weya laid her mother's beads beside a flake of obsidian. Nava placed a small coil of rawhide that had bound his father's bow. Sali, the old woman, plucked a red thread from her own tunic and tied it to a piece of driftwood before setting it in. "This is not for power," Tanu said, lighting the bundle. "This is not a shield. This is a mirror. It tells the spirits and the giants alike, we see you, and we will not go quietly." The fire took quickly, burning low and hot with no crackle. The smoke spiraled tightly, climbing straight into the sky before spreading like fingers. Tanu placed his foxbone charm beside the flame, letting the red light play across it. Then, slowly, he began to hum. It was a low tone, steady, circular, like breath caught in a loop. The others joined in, each voice folding into the next. No words, only intention. They pounded their palms lightly against the earth in rhythm, mimicking the heartbeat of the land. The smoke drifted across their faces. When it touched skin, it left behind faint red traces. Thin, curved lines like the fingers of ancestors marking them for the path ahead. Tanu opened his eyes. "They are watching," he said quietly. "And they know we're here. We will also let them know now that we see them too, and we come without fear." He didn't say whether he meant the spirits or the giants, maybe both. The fire burned down to ash, and no one moved to scatter it. They left it behind, as a sign, as a promise. They left the burned ritual behind before sunrise, the ash still warm in the wind. The mountains rose around them like crouched beasts, their shadows long and sharp in the new light. The trail they followed wound through cracked earth and boulders as large as huts. Tanu led the way, eyes scanning the ridgelines, bow strung and ready. For a time, there was only the sound of boots over gravel, leather creaking, and the hush of breath drawn slow. "We're close," Nava said, pointing towards the ridge where the cave lay hidden behind a broken wall of stone. "Another half day?" No one answered. Even Weya had grown quiet. They passed broken trees, snapped at the base, bent in unnatural angles, drag marks etched deep into the dust. Flies swarmed near a patch of fur and dried blood. The world had gone still. A raven watched from a dead branch overhead. Its eyes glinted in the sunlight, and it gave no call. Tanu noticed that even the wind no longer whistled through the canyons. It moved low, cautious, like it too feared to make noise. As they descended into the narrow gorge below the cave, the walls rose higher, narrowing the trail to a single path barely wide enough for two to walk side by side. Jagged brush clawed at their legs. Bones, deer, rabbit, something larger, littered the sides, half buried in the dust. After a long silence, Wea spoke. "I keep thinking of Kahi," she said, her voice flat. "How fast it was. One moment he was here. And then—" She trailed off. Nava glanced at her, but said nothing. Wea continued, softer. "He had a son. Born last winter. Only saw him twice. Kept saying he'd teach him to run the ridge paths. Said he was going to show him where the fox dens were." No one responded. The silence was a kind of grief. When they entered the deepest part of the gorge, the air grew heavy with the stink of decay. Something metallic underneath it, like rusted iron and wet teeth. They moved slower now, weapons drawn but low, each of them listening to the space between their heartbeats. Then, from the rear, Sally spoke. "I'm afraid." The words hung in the still air like smoke. No shame, no weakness, just truth. "I fought raiders before I had gray in my hair, faced wolves with nothing but a cooking knife and a scream. I didn't blink, but this—" She looked around, the crushed bones in the dust, the clawed bark on the trees, the strange hush in the gorge. "This is something older, like the earth made it to remind us what it meant to be prey." There was a pause. Then Wea said, without turning, "Fear is a door. Step through it, or it closes on you." Nava nodded. "My father used to say, it's not wrong to be afraid, but let it sharpen your eyes, not chain your feet." Tanu added, "Fear is part of the hunt. Every hunter knows it. But if it fills your lungs, if it becomes all you breathe, then you stop hearing the forest, you stop seeing the trail, and that's when it wins." Sally gave a tired smile. "Then I'll carry it beside me, not inside me." They pressed on. The gorge narrowed. Tanu crouched over a dark stain in the stone, still wet in the morning sun. Blood. He touched it with 2 fingers and smelled the copper. Nearby lay a shard of bone, cracked open like a hollow reed, a strip of copper-bound leather beside it. "Kahi," Wea whispered, her voice tight with something deeper than rage. Then the wind shifted, and what they thought to be a boulder started to move. The thing uncurled from the rocks like a waking nightmare, taller than any man, its shoulders wide enough to block the sun. Red hair hung in thick mats across its face, crusted with filth and dried blood. Its body was wrapped in what looked like stitched-together hides, not animal hide, but human. Some still had beadwork. In one hand, it clutched a strip of copper and leather, Kahi's scalp. It saw them and smiled. A grin like a broken mask, wide and full of 2 rows of teeth, jagged and yellowed, each like a splintered stone. "It's him!" Wea hissed. The giant didn't charge. It grabbed a nearby stone, the size of a cooking pot, and hurled it. It struck one of the younger warriors, Korah, barely 20 summers. The boulder caught him mid-run and crushed him into the canyon wall, his body folding with a wet, final crack. Blood misted the air. "Korah!" Sally screamed. Then the giant came. It barreled forward like an avalanche, arms outstretched. Nava threw his spear, catching it in the thigh. It howled, staggering, but kept coming. Wea darted left, her obsidian blade slashing across its ribs, spraying black-red blood that steamed as it hit the dust. Tanu rolled under its swing and plunged his knife into its lower back, twisting, ripping. The creature arched and slammed both fists down, but missed. Sally flung a pouch of burning sage at its face. It roared, blinded for a moment. When it regained its sight, it saw Weya and shot out an arm at incredible speed and grabbed her. It then lifted her high with its massive hand, with the intent to squeeze her into dust. She screamed at the increasing pressure and stabbed its wrist again and again until it let go. She hit the ground hard, but rolled away before its foot came down. Nava shouted, "Now! Draw it back!" He and Tanu sprinted toward a sharpened hunting spear they'd planted into the earth, angled and steady, its stone head glinting with venom-laced pitch. The giant was limping now, wounded, bleeding from a dozen gashes. Black-red blood poured down its leg and arm, but it was still fighting, still strong. Sali darted in from behind and slashed behind its knee, the hamstring tearing open with a wet rip. The giant howled and dropped to one knee, shaking the earth with the force of its weight. "Drive it! Toward the spear!" Tanu barked. Nava and Weya moved in together, driving the butt ends of their spears into the giant's chest and shoulders, trying to force it backward. The spear they'd planted earlier, a hardened oak shaft tipped with stone and tar, jutted from the ground behind it at a perfect angle, waiting. The giant saw it. It dug its massive hands into the earth, propping itself up from behind, resisting, arms trembling under the weight of its own body. "Bring it down! Bring it down!" Nava roared. Tanu sprinted forward, leapt onto the giant's broad back, and plunged both knives into its upper shoulders, wrenching backward with his full weight. The giant let out a deep grunt and began to tip backwards. Sally hit it low, driving her shoulder into its hip. Weya attacked the back of its knee. She audibly heard the sound of a tendon in the thing's leg pop as she drove the spear deep. With a final shove from Nava, the beast lost its balance. It tried to twist away, but too late. The giant fell backward, directly onto the waiting spear. The point punched through its back, shattered ribs, and erupted from its chest in a shower of dark blood. The sound was sickening, like wet stone being crushed in a vice. The creature let out one last breath, a gurgling gasp that sprayed blood across the dust. Its body twitched once, then it lay still. The silence that followed was like a great stone door closing. Every breath from the hunters came ragged, disbelieving. They stood over it, bloodied, gasping, staring at the impossible thing they had killed. "It's done," Nava said, chest heaving. Tanu slid off the back of the corpse and stood slowly. His blades were red to the hilt. The giant's body lay still, impaled, bleeding into the dry earth. The canyon echoed with their panting, their wounds, their disbelief. Tanu stood still, watching the blood pool beneath the corpse. Weya wiped her blade against her tunic and spoke first. "Did anyone else hear it?" she asked, not looking up. Sali nodded slowly. "Not just the end. I mean, when we hit it." "I counted 3, Nava muttered, crouching by the body. 3 times it cried out, short, sharp, like a wounded animal. "They don't do that," Weya said, now looking at the others. "None of the others. Not at Red Willow. Not the one in the gorge." "They grunt," said Tanu. "They breathe, but they never make sounds like that." "It was afraid," Sali whispered. "It felt pain, maybe more than the others." "Or maybe," Nava said grimly, "it was weaker. Dumber, sloppier. He was most likely an exile. That would explain why he is out during the day in this canyon. The others won't make the same mistake." A silence followed. Tanu stepped away from the corpse, eyes turning toward the cave entrance ahead, just visible now through the curling mist that rose from the gorge. "They heard it," he said. "If they're like animals, they'll smell it. If they're more, they'll remember it." The dust began to settle, but none of them moved far from the body. The giant's blood pooled like oil, thick and dark, soaking into the stone. It steamed slightly in the cooler air, carrying with it a bitter, coppery stench that clung to their tongues. Tanu knelt beside the corpse and unslung a small carved bowl from his pack. He dipped it into the blood without hesitation. "What are you doing?" Sali asked. He didn't answer at first. He stood and moved to the others, marking a rough circle in the dust with his heel. "Ahu told me," he said, "if one falls, mark yourselves. Let them know the old fire is still alive." Weya stepped forward. "With its blood?" "With its shame," Tanu replied. "Let them smell what we did." One by one, they approached the bowl. Tanu dipped his fingers and drew a line from brow to cheek, war paint in the color of vengeance. Weya did the same, then Nava, then Sali. When they were finished, they stood in a circle around the corpse, marked by the blood of their enemy, standing tall in the shadow of its broken body. "Take some of the hair," Nava said. "All of us. We'll wear it like the elder did." Sali stepped forward and used her knife to cut a length of the matted red hair, twisting it into a coil. She held it up to the others. "So we don't forget." Weya followed, then Nava, then Tanu. Each took a lock and tied it into a small braid with sinew or thread pulled from their packs. Some tucked it into a pouch, others tied it to their tunics, and Tanu wrapped his around the base of his knife hilt, where it would stain with every strike. "We'll weave it into our clothes when this is done," said Nava, his voice heavy with purpose. "Just like Ahu. Let the young ones see it when we return. Let them ask what it means." "And let us remember what it cost," Weya added. Tanu took the remaining braid of hair and wound it around the rim of the blood-stained bowl, then set it at the edge of the trail facing the cave. It looked almost ceremonial, like a shrine left for the dead, or a curse set to face the living. A warning in silence. "We are not prey." Then without another word they turned, leaving the canyon and heading toward their destiny. Chapter 5. Blood and fire. They stood at the dark mouth of the cave as the last light of day bled behind the mountains. The wind no longer moved here. Even the birds were silent. It yawned before them, black, wide, unnatural. The stone around the opening was black in places, discolored in others, as if smoke had once poured from its depths for years. Bones littered the approach. Some animal, some not. Tanu stood still for a long time, eyes scanning the shadows that stretched inward like reaching arms. The lock of red hair tied to his blade caught the light one last time before he sheathed it. He glanced at the others. This is where they were sealed before. Where the stories end. Nava nodded. And where ours begin. Weya ran her fingers over the stone wall at the entrance, as though trying to feel if it still remembered the last fire. "Do we try to burn them again?" she asked. "If the smoke can reach them," Tanu said. "If the fire holds." "And if it doesn't?" Sali asked. He didn't answer. Each of them stood with their own thoughts. Tanu thought of Ahu, of his warning. "If they see you, they may remember me, and they may hesitate." He hoped it would be enough. Nava stared into the dark and imagined every warrior he'd ever lost, every trail that ended in blood, and promised this one would end differently. Weya clutched the red hair woven into her sash, thinking of her children back home, and the silence of red willow. Sali rubbed the mark of blood still streaked across her cheek. She did not pray, but she remembered every name of the fallen and whispered them in her mind like drumbeats. They would not speak again, until the first torch was lit inside. The cave waited. Not like a place, but like a thing. Watching. And together they stepped inside. The moment they crossed the threshold, the air changed. It was thick, still, and carried a fetid heat, like rotting breath exhaled from deep within the mountain. The light of their torches, so bright when lit outside, felt swallowed here. It barely illuminated the stone walls, which glistened faintly with condensation and a black, tar-like residue that dripped in slow trails from the ceiling. The tunnel sloped down in tight curves. Underfoot, the ground was scattered with debris, gnawed bones, broken spears, bits of woven cloth. Some were half buried in dust, others disturbingly fresh. The walls bore marks, claw-like gouges and smears of reddish-brown. Hair, coarse and unmistakably red, was caught on jagged edges of the rock, matted in clumps where something enormous had passed. They came to a widened corridor flanked with hollowed-out alcoves, like an old temple carved by giants. Each space held something different. One was a hanging rack made of twisted wood and sinew, from which strips of dark flesh still dangled, slowly drying. Another contained trophies, human skulls daubed with ochre and stacked in crude pyramids. Bits of jewelry and bone charms hung from the walls beside them, strung like decorations on a child's toy. There were carvings, too, not with tools, but scraped by fingernails and sharp stones. Images of humans running, burning, screaming. Crude, violent depictions of the red-haired giants devouring prey, towering over stick-like figures with spears. Weya gagged behind her hand. Saley muttered a prayer she hadn't said since she was a girl. They kept moving. The corridor opened suddenly into a massive chamber, easily the size of a lodge hall. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above their torchlight. Stalactites loomed overhead like jagged teeth. All around, the nests returned, larger, more elaborate, mounds of skins, sticks, fur, bones, dried grass, even cradles made of woven willow branches. But the willow wasn't for children. And then they saw them. The giants. They were asleep. Dozens of them, curled or sprawled in pits and alcoves, their bodies partially wrapped in hide, stone, or bone. Some breathed heavily, making the dust rise and fall in rhythmic waves. Others twitched, lips peeling back to reveal worn, gnarled teeth, double rows, like the great beasts that swam in the sea. Their skin was dry, cracked, with the hue of rusted clay. Their hands were massive, one curled paw-like around a spear thick as a man's torso. One suckled something from its fingers. Another had a child-sized bone tucked under its arm like a doll. The sight froze them. Tanu gestured for stillness, and they stood for what felt like eternity, watching the rise and fall of giant chests, the slow flare of breath from noses the size of war horns. Then, movement. Near the back of the chamber, against a stone shelf slick with moisture, a cluster of young ones shifted. Smaller giants, half-grown, lean and long-limbed like starved wolves. Their eyes opened but did not blink. They stared blankly at the flickering firelight. One tilted its head, as if listening. Another sniffed the air. Tanu whispered, "Back!" He didn't wait for confirmation. They moved in absolute silence. No one dared speak. The sound of their footfall seemed too loud, even when padded by leather soles and careful steps. Behind them, in the chamber, one of the young let out a low grunt, a question more than a cry. The air shifted slightly. A large body stirred, turned, and then stilled. When they reached the passage again, they moved faster, breathing only when the blackness of the chamber was swallowed behind the bend. Only when they saw the dim glimmer of natural light in the far distance did Weah finally exhale. Her shoulders trembled. "They're not just alive," Nava murmured, voice dry as stone. "They're multiplying." Tanu didn't reply, because he had counted at least 40. They emerged from the cave mouth like ghosts. The night air struck their skin, cool and sharp, but none of them welcomed it. They stood in a loose cluster, heads low, eyes darting to the dark ridges above them, as if the mountain might rise and speak. No one said a word for a long time. The torches sputtered in the wind, and only the shifting of stones beneath their feet broke the silence. Tanu knelt, drawing a line in the dirt with his knife. "They're breeding," he said. "We saw young ones. 6, maybe more. Adults sleeping in the walls. Maybe 40. 40, Nava repeated, voice low. "That's more than twice the old count." "They're nesting," Weah added. "Making homes, decorated like it's sacred, like they plan to stay." "And what we saw," Sally said, "was only one chamber." That thought hovered over them like a second moon. Tanu stood. "We can't fight them. Not in there." Nava nodded. "The tunnels choke you. The air is theirs. We'd be dead before we loosed a second arrow." "They didn't move much," Weah said. "They seemed drowsy." "Resting after a hunt," Sally muttered. Tanu looked back toward the cave entrance. "If they're resting, then now is the moment." "To burn them?" Nava asked. "Yes, but not just a fire. A pyre. One the gods can see." He drew a rough plan in the dirt. Stone walls for wind shielding, layers of green pine to smother, pitch-soaked roots and fat to smoke, bone-dry kindling for spark. Weah shook her head. "We can't gather that much here. Not before the light breaks." "There's a place," Tanu said, eyes narrowing. "Red Willow." They turned toward him. "There was a hunting cache, a hidden pit near the north tree line. My cousin's son and I buried it seasons ago. It was meant for hard winters. Oil, smoked fat, wrapped bark, green resin, kindling and waxed hide. If it wasn't found—" "They never needed it," Weah said softly, already understanding. "Not before they were taken." Tanu nodded. "We'll go by moonlight. Quietly, in and out." Nava looked to the sky. 3 hours if we move fast." "We move fast," Tanu said. "We build fast. We burn hard." "And if they wake before then?" Sally asked. Tanu picked up a smoothed stone, cracked and blackened by time. "Then we make sure they never leave this mountain again." They moved like shadows under a sickle moon. The land remembered what had happened. The breeze did not stir the grass, and no owls called from the trees. Even the stars seemed to hang back, veiled behind high clouds as the 4 hunters crept down the ridgeline toward what remained of Red Willow. The village had not changed. Tents lay half-burned, collapsed upon themselves like the broken backs of great animals. The fish racks still stood, though the hides had long since blackened. Bones and scraps littered the earth, some piled by scavengers, others half-buried where the earth had tried to forget. No one spoke. They passed the fire circle where Eli had been thrown, now filled with ash and caved embers. They passed the lodge where Kalek had fallen, his spear still shattered beneath the soot. Weah crouched and picked up a small carved animal from the dirt, one of Kalek's bone totems. She wiped it clean, tucked it into her sash, and said nothing. Tanu led them to the north tree line. The brambles were thick, grown wild over the seasons. He knelt, cleared the brush with a practiced hand, and uncovered a flat stone, then a layer of woven reeds. Beneath that, the cache. Sealed in waxed hide and clay jars were bundles of oiled pine, cured animal fat, sealed fire pitch, and coiled ropes of resin-rich root. Fire in every form, waiting. "It's all here," he said. They worked quickly, wrapping the bundles in cloth, strapping jars to their backs. Saley found an old basket and packed it with split kindling. Wea took a jar of bear fat and smeared it across a length of bark to test it. It caught fire instantly when she pressed a coal to it. "Hot enough," she murmured. Nava stood sentinel at the village edge, an arrow nocked and ready. He didn't look at the ruins. He only stared toward the mountain. When they'd gathered all they could carry, they paused at the center of the village. Each took a handful of earth and scattered it to the wind. Not for the dead, but for the living who would hear their names. Tanu thought of his cousin's daughter, who had not found her name yet. He simply dropped the dirt and said, "I miss you, little one." Wea whispered Kalek's name. Sali, surprisingly, whispered no name, but her hand gripped her sash where the lock of red hair was tied. Nava simply raised his fist to the stars. And then they left Red Willow for the last time. The weight on their backs was not heavy, but what they carried would either end a nightmare or feed one. They worked in silence at first, forming a crescent before the cave mouth, building upward like a barricade of prayer and fury. Nava drove a sharpened stake into the ground and looked up at the rising crescent. "We're building a pyre, not a wall." "A wall won't hold them," Tanu said, "but this might bury them in smoke." "We better hope," Wea added. "The wind favors the cave. If it shifts—" "It won't," Sally said flatly. She knelt to smear pitch onto a length of sinew. "Not tonight." Tanu poured pine pitch into a crevice of stacked wood. "Do you remember the way the air felt in there? Thick. Still, like it hadn't moved in years." "It's their coffin," Nava muttered. "We're just sealing the lid." They kept working. Sweat rolled down their necks despite the night chill. The fire hadn't even begun, and the air felt charged, like the ancestors themselves were watching. Wea bound bundles of sage into the cracks between logs, her hands shaking slightly. "I've never seen anything that strong," she said, voice low. "That thing in the gorge. What if they don't die from this?" "They're not gods," Sali replied, handing her another bundle. "Just monsters. And even monsters bleed." Nava laid down the final support beam and stood back. The crescent was complete. Overhead, towering and packed so tightly it looked like the skeleton of some ancient beast. Tanu stepped forward with the torch. He paused. "Anyone want to say anything?" Silence. Then Sali, quietly, "Let this be the last fire they ever see." Wea nodded. "For Red Willow, for Kalek, for Eli and Rima." "For all who vanished without names," Nava said. "For the ones we never found." Tanu lit the base. The fire caught instantly, pitch hissing, sage crackling, fat melting into flame. Heat surged outward in a wave, forcing them to take a step back. The wind was drawn in, pulled into the mouth like the cave itself was gasping. Then came the first alerted grunt from the cave. One of them knew something was happening. The fire roared. It rose fast and furious, climbing the stacked cedar and sage like a starving thing. The flames coiled high above the cave mouth, turning the rock face to molten gold, then searing white. The wood cracked and bled pitch. The smoke curled inward, into the mountain, like a living thing seeking vengeance. Then came the first scream. It was one of the little ones from deep within the cave. It pierced the night like a bone flute snapped in half. Raw, guttural, panicked. Tanu turned sharply to the group. "Remember what they did to Red Willow. Remember what they did to our brothers and sisters. Their blood cries from the earth for vengeance. After tonight, they will be at peace." From the darkness inside, another voice joined it. Not a scream. It was something choking, fighting for breath. "They're waking up," Weya said, her voice dry. "And they're trapped." A giant shape surged toward the mouth of the cave, its head crowned in smoldering hair, shoulders scraping the sides of the passage. Its arms flailed against the inferno, eyes wide and streaming smoke. It was panicked, no longer a hunter, but prey, and slammed into the burning barricade. The fire embraced it. Pitch clung to its skin. Sage smoke filled its lungs. It dropped to its knees and collapsed sideways into the pyre. Bones cracked. The flames surged. Another form crawled behind it. Smaller, maybe younger. It clawed against the ash-covered stone, dragging its mass forward by burned hands and elbows. Half its face was blackened. Its mouth opened wide, but no sound came, only smoke billowing from within. It died at the threshold, reaching toward the stars it would never see again. Behind them, deeper inside the cave, came the thunder of panic. Giants crashing into one another, stumbling through smoke as the fire pushed them back the way they came. The cave funneled the heat inward, and with each moment, the sounds of their massive fists pounding the stone and bodies hitting each other grew louder, and then fewer. Smoke continued to billow in the mouth of the cave in a thick black column. Tanu raised his hand to block the heat. "They're not coming out." Nava nodded slowly, awe in his voice. "They can't. Their bodies are piling up and the heat is too intense." The flame reached its full height now, licking the stone arch above the entrance, blackening everything. The wall of fire hissed and buckled as fat and pitch turned molten. The rocks themselves cracked, glowing red at their seams. "I can hear them falling," Sally whispered, "like trees in a storm." "And choking," Weya added. "It's in their lungs now." Tanu said nothing. His face was stone. Hours passed. The stars vanished behind smoke. The night grew quiet again. No birds, no wind, just the breathless pull of the blaze and the soft thuds of giants dying in the dark. By dawn, nothing in the cave was moving. What remained was silence and ash. The mouth of the cave glowed a dull orange. Around it, the stone had turned black, blistered and glass smooth. The barricade had collapsed inward, sealing the entrance with charred timber and bone. Nothing moved. No giant escaped. The hunters stood in silence for a long time, staring at what they had done, not in triumph, but in reckoning. The mountain had been wounded, and it would never forget. Weya stepped forward first, pulling the lock of red hair from her sash and weaving it tightly into her outer tunic. She tied it over her heart. For Eli, for Red Willow, and for those who will never know their names. Sally followed, braiding her lock into the hem of her sleeve, then used the blood from a wound on her palm to mark it. "So we remember what they cost, and what we gave to stop them." Nava bound his into the strap of his blade scabbard stained red from the fight with the giant in the canyon. "So that if they ever return, our grandchildren will already know the smell of their blood." Tanu hesitated. Then he tied his lock around the foxbone charm. He fastened it around his neck and let it rest against his chest. "We speak of them," he said, "often and loudly." The others nodded. "We tell the story at every fire," Weya added. "We say their names," said Sali, "even if it chills the skin." "We warn," said Nava. They stood together before the scorched cave and raised their hands, not in prayer, but in pledge. "This place is sealed," Tanu said, "but the memory must stay open." And as the ashes cooled behind them, the 4 survivors turned and walked back down the mountain, not to forget, but to remember. Their red threads burned bright in the rising sun, and somewhere far below, where grass still grew and rivers still ran, the world turned slowly forward, unaware that its future had been bought by fire. But in every village they passed, in every circle of flame they sat beside, the story would be told. Of giants, of smoke, and of the last hunt. Afterward. The Last Hunt is a work of fiction, but it walks alongside truths carried for generations. The story of the red-haired giants has echoed through the oral histories of the Piute, Shoshone, and Washoe peoples of the American West. Though its details shift with each telling, its core remains. A memory of something ancient, terrifying, and all too real to those who lived in its shadow. This story wasn't written to prove or disprove legend. It was written to honor it, to remind us that not everything is forgotten, that not everything buried stays asleep, and that in the quiet places of the world, where stone holds smoke and silence runs deep, the old stories still breathe, waiting to be remembered. Further reading and exploration. If you're interested in learning more about the legends that inspired this story, consider exploring Life Among the Piutes, Their Wrongs and Claims by Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins. Lovelock Cave by Llewellyn L. Loud and Mark R. Harrington. The Red-Haired Giants Were Real by The Y-Files on YouTube. These resources don't offer final answers, but they keep the story alive. Thank you so much for listening.